Hello, Condoleezza Rice will touch down in the Middle East with the weight of administration on her shoulders.
In a few hours, the US Secretary of State lands in Israel to begin a whirlwind tour of the region aimed at salvaging what's a growing crisis for her boss, George Bush.
In a moment, we'll be live in Jerusalem and Gaza. But first, Al Jazeera's Jan looks at what's at stake.
America's top diplomat leading support for the new US-Iraq policy. Condoleezza Rice is in Israel and the Palestinian territories this weekend before heading to Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait.
The situation in Iraq is unacceptable.
But promoting plans for another 21,500 troops in Iraq is likely to be as tough in the Middle East as it has been at home with a hostile Congress. Analysts say Condoleezza Rice will use her visit to drive home the message that the Arab world must do more to help Iraq.
I do believe that she will pass a number of major responsibilities on the implementation of Bush's new strategy on Iraq to a number of Arab countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, and certainly Israel.
Iran and Syria will also dominate the Secretary of State's discussions. The Iranian consulate in the northern Iraqi town of Erbil was raided on Thursday. Several people were detained. The US is vowing to stop Iran and Syria from funding and arming the insurgency.
Iraq Study Group report.
Last year, the high-profile Baker Hamilton report urged the Bush administration to hold talks with Tehran and Damascus to help find a solution in Iraq. Also topping Condoleezza Rice's agenda will be the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, but little progress is expected. The Secretary of State is not traveling to the region with a new Israeli-Palestinian peace plan, and nor will she meet with representatives of the Hamas-led, democratically elected government in the Palestinian territories.
The United States is determined to destroy Hamas cabinet, Hamas government, and push it possibly further to a marginal force inside the occupied territories by bringing the two major factions closer to a civil war.
This is the 8th visit in 2 years to the Middle East by Condoleezza Rice. Previous trips have had only limited impact. The Secretary of State now has 1 week to prove that this time it can be different. John Terrett, Al Jazeera.
Well, Al Jazeera's David Chater is in Jerusalem. David, Condoleezza Rice is saying she hasn't come armed with a plan. So what is she going to achieve, do you think?
That's right. She said during a stopover in Shannon to journalists there that any plan with a stamp "Made in America" on it would have no chance here. So she's arriving empty-handed in what Washington would call a fact-finding mission. Now, the first people she's going to meet here are two members of the Israeli cabinet, the foreign minister and the defense minister. And much to the chagrin of the Israeli Prime Minister, his ministers have been coming up with a lot of their own peace plans. So Condoleezza Rice will be listening in to what those two ministers have to say. But the most interesting one is, of course, the foreign minister, Tzipi Livni's plan, where she thinks that you should jump the first stage of the so-called roadmap solution and go straight to a Palestinian state with temporary borders based on the very controversial separation wall being built on the West Bank. So Condoleezza Rice will be listening in, taking notes with her officials, if you like, to try and find out if there's anything new, if there are any chances, anything they could develop. But that's about it.
And David, I mean, she's still presumably also looking for help in the region for Iraq.
Well, I think it's very clear that the main focus of this whole trip is the so-called new strategy in Iraq, but it does look like old wine in a new bottle. So she'd be asking very much for the support of the moderate states because Iraq is the focus and the main problem now for President Bush, and she's carrying a heavy burden on her shoulders. But there is one other thing here that in Israel she'll be trying to sort of deal with, and that's the fact that George Bush has asked for $86 million for supporting, from Congress that money is coming from, for supporting the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and to support especially his security services. They feel that he needs that support at the moment with what's happening in the occupied Palestinian territories with Hamas. And the more they can bolster him, the more they can undermine Hamas. So that'll be another strategy she's trying to work out during her time here.
And David, just on another matter, which of course the Israelis are worried about, is the influence of Iran. George Bush apparently did sanction the attacks on Iranian interests in Iraq. How is that playing, do you think, in the discussions?
Well, for Israel, certainly Iran is guaranteed to be the most threatening existential threat at the moment. They are very worried by the fact that these limited sanctions don't seem to be stopping the Iranians from developing uranium enrichment. They feel that that is the most important point that has to be discussed. But the Israeli Prime Minister at the moment here in the ratings is at an all-time low. One of the latest opinion polls put his support amongst the public down at 14%. So does the Israeli Prime Minister, no matter how many discussions he has with the Americans, and he's well liked in America, have any political capital left? Is he a player anymore on the scene? These are the problems. Even if they're discussing Iran, Iraq, or the Palestinian-Israeli peace issues, does the Israeli Prime Minister anymore have the political capital to make any progress? That's what's worrying Washington.
OK, David Chater in Jerusalem, thank you very much indeed.
Well, just hours before Condoleezza Rice arrives in the region, the Palestinian Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh was accusing the United States and Israel of inciting a civil war.
The pillars of American-Israeli policy are based on preventing the establishment of national unity, inciting a Palestinian civil war, and hindering our national project. Therefore, with all clarity, as a people, forces, factions, presidency, government, internal and external, we should adopt a Palestinian strategy based on protecting Palestinian national unity and working toward a Palestinian national unity government that protects our rights.
And we'll be talking to our correspondent in Gaza, Noor O'Day, a little bit later in the programme.
And later on in this hour of news on Al Jazeera, tension in Russia over a dramatic rise in the country's Islamic population.
Well, Somalia's parliament has declared a 3-month state of emergency and may be about to impose martial law to restore security. But wider efforts to stabilise the country by bringing in African Union peacekeepers may be running into trouble. Well, Mohammed Ado is with us from Mogadishu. Mohammed, what more do we know about this plan to impose martial law?
Well, Darren, this morning the Somali parliament sitting at the provincial town of Baidoa approved the introduction of martial law in Somalia, largely to take care of the runaway insecurity in the country. Somalia is a country that's now coming together and coming out of 16 years of anarchy, and the government wants to use this law to try and pacify the country. And some of the things this law, the martial law, will give the government a free hand to do is to deal with all those in possession of firearms and those who own firearms, as well as militiamen who have to be disarmed. The martial law also bans any demonstrations and also gives the power, excess powers to the president to come up with any decrees aimed at securing the country.
Mohammed, the South Africans are voicing their concerns about the African peacekeeping efforts. Is that initiative running into trouble now, do you think?
Well, that is what people are saying, especially Kenya, that has earlier on been mandated to go and seek the peacekeepers from African nations. The thing that has complicated the whole exercise is the U.S. airstrikes in southern Somalia. Many African countries that had earlier on showed their readiness to contribute to the peacekeepers to be deployed in Somalia are now pulling their legs about the whole matter, saying that if they take their forces to Somalia at this time, then they may be seen running errands for the U.S. in its war against terrorism. And one of these countries is South Africa.
What sort of timetable, Mohammed, are we looking at now in terms of this African Union peacekeeping force? Because obviously the South Africans have expressed concern. Is it going to happen and when?
Well, the government right now is exuding a lot of confidence that it will have peacekeepers, and they say the first bunch of peacekeepers will be coming from Uganda, which has promised to send 1,500 of its troops to Somalia. What they are saying is that they need the peacekeepers in terms of weeks, and they want to get them in as urgently as possible, because Ethiopia is getting very, very anxious about living, because its troops are facing so much animosity inside